welcome to the Casual Historian Podcast. My name is Grant, and this is my co-host, James.
Hello, everyone.
This is the podcast where me and my friend, a pair of history buffs, talk about all the things that we don't get to talk to in our history classes. And today, it is James' topic.
Today is going to be a fun topic for me because I'm a masochist. And it's also very topical. Earlier in February, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, announced that June 23rd would be the date of a referendum on whether or not the United Kingdom would remain in the European Union, which is itself the culmination of something that kind of started in the aftermath of World War II. In Zurich, Switzerland, in 1946, Winston Churchill referred to the need for a United States of Europe. And obviously the United States, where we are, is a federal state. So what we're going to talk about today is it's going to be a look at federalism in Europe. Its many shades, shapes, colors, and how admirable it can be in terms of a clean structure, or sometimes how messy it can be.
This is one of the things that I am not extremely knowledgeable about, but I know just enough to ask questions to have my co-host elaborate a lot more on. So let's start with the only thing I am very familiar with in terms of federalism in Europe, and that is Germany, or as I learned in my German class in high school, the Bundesrepublik of Deutschland. So I guess I'm familiar with American federalism and the divide of power between the federal central government and the state governments. But what is the divide of power between, say, the central government in Germany and all of its state governments?
Well, I'm glad you led with Germany, because understanding European federalism, really, you have to understand Germany's federalism. And before I answer your question, I'm just going to throw this out there for our listeners. A federal state is different from a unitary state. A unitary state is a country where there are no autonomous or self-governing subdivisions, that pretty much all power is vested in one central authority. An example of that would be France. There are local governments, of course, but it's not federal. All legislative power resides with the government in Paris. Whereas Germany is a federal state in which there is both federal power at a national level in Berlin, as well as the powers of the states, or the Länder of Germany, in their respective capitals. But the relation of power between the federal government, or the Bundestag, in Berlin, and the governments of the Länder in Germany is not nearly as adversarial as the relationship between Washington and state capitals in the U.S. can be at times. The U.S. has a long history of its federalism, because it sprang into existence first as a confederacy where it was too loosely joined to be effective, and then with the introduction of the U.S. Constitution has generally been an ongoing tension between either centralizing power in Washington or maintaining power in the states. And I'm not going to, go into an issue of, American states' rights, because that's a totally separate issue. But Germany has never really had the quite the same issues the U.S. had in its approach to federalism. In fact, in a lot of ways, everyone put your hipster glasses on. Germany was federalist before federalism was really a concretely notioned political structure. And the reason I say that is because you have to go back in time to a time when a map of Europe looked like someone dropped a stained glass window. And what I'm referring to in this case is the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire now comprises what are now Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, the Czech Republic, Western Poland, northeastern France, northern Italy, and Slovenia. And it's also worth noting that of those, you have not only Germany as a federation, but you also have federations in Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland as a confederacy. But, it's interesting, though, because the reason why the empire plays a role in this federal structure is that over time, the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire were increasingly weak. They weren't a hereditary monarchy. They had to be elected, even though by practice, monarchs came from just one dynasty. But their ability to actually exert direct power over all of the empire was limited. Emperors pretty much only had direct control over their own territory. So for most of its history, for the Habsburgs, that would have referred to pretty much what's now Austria and the Czech Republic and a few other smaller states. The other territories ruled by an assembly of feudal rulers like dukes, margraves, or counts, imperial knights, clergy in the prince bishoprics and prince archbishoprics, were pretty much had control over their own territories. However, by the 30 Years' War, the Reformation has kind of driven a polarizing wedge between the Catholics in the empire and the two big groups of Protestants on the other. You have, Lutherans and Calvinists. And the introduction of the principle of cuius regio eius religio, or who rules their religion, becomes the mainstay, which is the idea that nobody, not even the emperor, can interfere in the decision of whatever member state of the empire chooses for its religion. And this lays a cornerstone for the way Germany will go on to develop. At its height, the empire had 300 member states. 300. That's messy. By the time we get to the French Revolutionary Wars, there was what was called the mediatization, in which this large number is reduced to less than 100 states. And by the Congress of Vienna, when the Napoleonic Wars end, Germany has about 48 states that remain. You have big states like Austria and Prussia, to mid-sized states like Bavaria and Hanover, and still, small little micro-states like, the Principality of Hohenzollern-Hechingen and Sigmaringen, and the old free cities of Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck, and Frankfurt. As Germany unifies, its approach is unique, because we look at Germany's nearest neighbor, great power, France. France became a unitary state, not so much because of the ability of a monarch to be extremely powerful, but because of certain circumstances that resulted in France becoming more unitary. France, like Germany, was once divided into a bunch of duchies and counties, but over time, as results of the 100 Years' War and other conflicts, resulted in large amounts of French nobility simply dying, and these major titles reverting to the King of France, who could then give them out as kind of honorifics. Feudal power became vested solely in the person of the monarch of France. Whereas in Germany, there were consistently many monarchs. And indeed, when Germany does unify as the German Empire, it is actually a federation, because you have the emperor, who is also the king of Prussia, but you still have kings in Bavaria, in Saxony, and other countries within the empire. And interestingly enough, in the imperial model for Germany, some of the other states like Bavaria or Saxony still had their own armies, and in fact had their own foreign services. So over time, that ideal has persisted. After World War I, when the empire gives way to the Weimar Republic, the federation is maintained. In fact, the internal boundaries are exactly the same. It's just instead of kings and dukes and counts, you have free states. And then the Nazi interlude is the only time that Germany was a unitary state. After World War II, boundaries are somewhat redrawn, but once again, a federal model is instituted in Western Germany and then later on reunified Germany. And humorously enough, even that feature I mentioned where the kingdoms of the empire still had foreign ministries, nowadays, German states are potentially subjects of international law. They can actually sign treaties in their own right if they have consent from the Bundestag in Berlin.
So I guess you mentioned in the early part that the kind of federalism we see in Germany is less adversarial than it is here in the States. I guess you may have mentioned this and I may have not picked it up, but what in particular makes it less adversarial, as in, I guess, why is there less conflict between the central government and the state governments?
Well, first off, the German constitution is much more detailed than ours is. The second one is that the current Germany, the current federal Germany, is just the latest in a series of incarnations of some sort of German entity. Before the current German Republic, you have Nazi Germany, which I'll pass over because of its how odd it is in German history, structurally speaking. Then you have, before that, Weimar Germany, Imperial Germany, the German Confederation. You have the Napoleonic Confederation of the Rhine of puppet states, and you have the empire before that. But in all of these, the common denominator is the idea that the states, the Länder of Germany, as they're called now, have an element of self-governance, an element of culture that has existed there for centuries. And so, I guess you could say that, the national governments and their structures may have come and gone, but the local smaller governments in Germany always maintained their existence. For example, the well-known state of Bavaria in Germany as it is now is geographically almost exactly the same as the old kingdom of Bavaria that existed during the 19th century, which itself was just an expanded version of the old duchy. So, in Germany, you don't have a situation where the federal government is in a position to really try to gain more power at the expense of states nowadays, mostly because, one, their constitution is clear enough to disallow that, but also because simply centuries of culture and history that do help shape identity would prevent that.
So basically you're saying the reason that it's less adversarial is because the central government in Germany acknowledges that, yes, you have existed longer than we have. You have these rights. You have this history, and we're going to acknowledge that and let you have it. While here in the United States, the individual states, most of them did not exist before the United States came into existence in any form. And the ones that did weren't really super independent beforehand.
Right. In the case of the United States, on independence, we have the Articles of Confederation, and a short time after we have the Constitution. But before that, they were simply colonial governments, 13 colonial governments under the sovereignty of Great Britain. Whereas in Germany, you had, up to 300, of course, but you had a situation where you had states that were in many ways functionally independent. The ability to raise their own armies, levy taxes, all things which the colonial governments in the United States were generally not proficient at doing on their own. So we have centuries of evolution in Germany of individual states that eventually do accrete into the recognizable forms we have now. Whereas with the U.S., you have the leap from colonial governments answerable to a central authority in London become independent, and there was something of a culture shock. There was this the sudden lack of a central authority was problematic. The Confederation didn't work. So then we have the Constitution created, which creates a strong central government in Washington, but there was, from get-go, a great deal of tension as to how much power Washington should exert vis-a-vis the states.
I see. So that is interesting. I am American. My specialty is American history, and I could tell you that all the colonies thought of themselves as being independent countries of their own, but adding this perspective of how much longer these German states have been their own entities, even though the United States became a political entity on the modern world stage before modern Germany did, it's really interesting. I'm definitely going to have to look more into that part of German history in order to give that self a bit more perspective. But I think we should move on to the UK and its lack of federalism.
Yeah, it's important to note that the UK is an example of what can happen when a federal model is not in play. And it's important to understand also that, in, for example, Germany or the U.S., the federal government derives its sovereignty from the combined agreement, basically, of the member states. As a matter of fact, the very word federalism or federation, the root word fedus, means covenant or treaty in Latin. And in German, you'll hear terms like Bundesrat or Bundestag, which actually is a cognate of the word bond in English. So the UK, on its the foundation of its current form is based in 1707 on the Act of Union. Before that, for about a century and a half, England and Scotland were ruled by the same monarch in personal union, but they each were still governed by their own local powers in London and Edinburgh. But when the Acts of Union took place, it wasn't that they said we are now going to form Great Britain and then England and Scotland will remain somewhat separate in some way. What actually took place was that at that moment, the monarchies of England and Scotland ceased to exist and were replaced with a new monarchy, the monarchy of Great Britain. Similarly, there was now no longer a Parliament of England and a Parliament of Scotland. Those were dissolved and replaced with a Parliament of the United Kingdom. And later on to that would be added Ireland. So the UK, as we know it, is technically speaking a unitary state. All power is derived from the central government in London, even though, as you may be aware, there are governments in Edinburgh, Scotland, in Wales, and in Northern Ireland. But these are called devolved governments. They have their power via a grant of sorts from the central government in London or in Westminster, which means, technically speaking, that the government could then legally revoke the devolved status of one of these governments, as did happen in Northern Ireland during the 1970s. But I think this is an important example because one feature of federalism is not merely that the members all come together to form a whole, but there's a sense that each member is equal to another. For example, in Germany, you have the well-populated state of Bavaria is constitutionally equal to the tiny little free city of Hamburg, as far as the law goes. But in the UK, devolution, rather than federalism, has been piecemeal and on a kind of ad hoc basis. So Scotland's parliament has a great deal of power, but that was negotiated directly with Scotland itself from London. Similarly, the peace process in Northern Ireland created the structure of the Northern Ireland executive, whereas both Scotland and Northern Ireland have pretty much agreements that say you can do whatever you like except for these things which are reserved for the UK Parliament, like foreign policy or defense policy, for example. Then you have Wales, where instead of having reserved powers for Westminster, Westminster says, these are what we let you do. And that's potentially problematic for the future of the UK, because in terms of actual scope and power, Scotland is not equal to Northern Ireland, is not equal to Wales. And England itself has no devolved government whatsoever, and is dependent solely on Westminster for all of its lawmaking powers.
Yes, but I'm willing to bet you'll have the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish willing to say, well, the British government in London is the English government, which I guess you could sort of say was, because in reality, the English Parliament pretty much did just absorb the Scottish Parliament when the Act of Union happened.
Effectively, yes. Legally speaking, no. I guess that might be what they call legal fiction in this case. But there is a very strong sense in Northern Ireland, in Wales, and especially in Scotland, that the Westminster government is a predominantly English body. They are absolutely right. England on its own supplies far more members of parliament than Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland combined, which means that the English do drive laws. But there is also a kind of a reverse problem, which is why federalism might be a solution the UK should seriously consider in its future, if it wants to actually remain a united kingdom. England, with its utter lack of representation, means that with most of its laws being voted on in Westminster directly, despite the introduction of a recent standing order, which is English votes for English laws, up until this point, Scottish MPs, Northern Irish MPs, and Welsh MPs could vote on laws that affect English citizens. But if there were areas such as, for example, education, which are devolved to all three, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, English MPs have no votes there. But Scots, Northern Irish, or Welsh could vote on education for England, which is partly why this is. It's messy, and the British approach has created more problems really than it's solved.
Yes, it sounds like that, but I guess Federal Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland doesn't sound as catchy as United.
Well, you don't even need to say federal. It would just be an adjustment of how the regions interact. And you don't even necessarily, you may not even necessarily want to have England be a single federal subject. Excuse me, a single federal subject in such a structure, because there are vast cultural differences in different parts of England, arguing perhaps for a return to the old county system.
Those Northumbrians, they're always causing problems.
Not to mention the Cornish.
Well, the Cornish, they're just Welsh, and they don't want to say they're Welsh.
But what's happening in the UK is really symptomatic of what happens when you do have greater desires for self-government, and federalism or federations can be created where there wasn't one before. An example of this is Belgium. Belgium became independent in the early 19th century after spending centuries of being part of other people's countries. It gained its independence from the Netherlands. Before that, it was under French control. Before that, Austrian. Before that, Spanish. Before that, Burgundian, which was basically French anyway. But by the time we get to the 19th century, the Northern Netherlands, what we now call the Netherlands, are largely Protestant, Calvinist specifically, whereas the Southern Netherlands, what's now Belgium and Luxembourg, were largely Catholic. At the time, this was enough to provide something of a national identity, that they did not want to be ruled by an absolute Protestant monarch, so they seceded, became the Kingdom of Belgium, a constitutional monarchy ruled by a Catholic. Well, a Protestant who converted to Catholicism because dynastic reasons. But Belgium, as society has become more and more secular, religious denomination has not been enough to keep Belgium together, because Belgium geographically actually comprises two distinct ethnicities or two distinct linguistic groups. One, Flanders or the Flemish, in the west and north of the country, who speak Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch, part of the West Saxon group, and in the south and east of the country, the Walloons, who speak a variant of French. And tension exists basically between the two groups. So as a measure of addressing this, a federal model was proposed, which might seem odd for a country as small as Belgium. But it is working somewhat to allay tension between the two, in which there is a Wallonia for the French speakers, Flanders for the Flemish speakers, and the area around Brussels is a third entity as well. Each of these groups is self-governing, have their own governments, but are answerable to the central government in Brussels.
Yeah, that's one of the situations I have heard of with, not in regards to federalism, but in threats of dividing and seceding parts of European countries. And it just sort of seems like it's one of those things that it's not going to hold on forever without something nasty happening. Kind of like how the Spanish constantly hold on to Catalonia.
Well, the Spanish clinging to Catalonia and also the Basque country are examples of why devolved government is so dangerous. Because technically speaking, Spain is in fact a unitary state. but due to the strength of feeling in the country, both in terms of its maintaining its existing form, juxtaposed with the desire for greater autonomy and self-governance in Catalonia and in the Basque Country, there's a great deal of tension. And so the intractability of the governments in Madrid to provide a truly federal model are actually making the situation worse, I would say, because though there have been movements to devolve power to both the Basques and to the Catalans, to other groups in Spain, like the British model, it's very haphazard, very ad hoc, and because, again, in a devolved state, the power, in theory, can be taken away at any time. Whereas in Germany or in the U.S., the central government can't simply say, you no longer have this power. Whereas in theory, the Spanish Parliament or the UK Parliament could, with one motion, strip the rights of, say, the Basques, the Catalans, which is very dangerous if one wants to see the country move forward.
Well, then, I guess since we're already on the continent of Europe, let's move on to, I guess, the crux of this idea of federalism in Europe and the, I'm not sure whether to call it a lack of federalism or just badly designed federalism in the European Union.
Right. So the European Union, in many ways, is still really much more of a confederation than a federation. I mentioned Churchill's quote where he speaks of the United States of Europe. And the European Union, I must say, has actually done important things. It and its predecessor organizations did a very important job of, one, helping Europe recover from World War II, and promoting a new spirit of cooperation and friendliness among European governments, which was really revolutionary. I mean, considering that for the previous few centuries of human history, European governments fighting each other had led to some of the most devastating conflicts the world had ever seen.
Well, you can only bash each other's head in so often, with one of those bashings involving genocide before people just sort of lose all energy to do it.
Exactly. And so the Europeans finally got wise to the idea that they could achieve more by grouping together rather than expending their energy trying to kill each other. And the EU has been the product of that dream. And I think that that concept is not so much a scary one, but the EU itself has become very, very difficult. The average citizen of any country may not be able to explain to you very well how their own government works. Trying to explain the EU and the radically complicated treaties that create it, its odd processes, becomes frustrating. It becomes so remote and obtuse that it can lose legitimacy in the eyes of the beholder. Its parliament has almost no initiative on its own. The European Parliament can only debate legislation proposed by the Commission. Members of the Commission are appointed by the individual member governments. And then I won't even get into the odd distinctions between the Council of Europe, the European Council, and the Council of the European Union, all of which exist but are separate from each other and do different jobs. I think that because of the pace of integration, there are some who do truly want to see a federal Europe. And I think you especially see these groups in France, in Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Italy, basically the core of Europe. But some of the newer states may be less enthusiastic about it, especially those in Eastern Europe. Some might be too weak to be able to contribute effectively, like, say, Greece in its present form.
Yeah, though I think there is a desire amongst the elites in the core countries of the European Union to have a more federalized system, I think the issue is that they all imagine what this federalized system would look like would be differently. I mean, the Germans have a different aspiration and view for the European Union than the French do.
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree with that. The treaties commit Europe to ever closer union, which, by the way, is one of the big objections the Brits have developed recently in terms of why this referendum is happening. Britain's now exempt from it because Britain likes to pretend that it's on an island off the coast of Europe, so much as it thinks that it's a continent like North America. But the what's called the Franco-German motor, this core of cooperation has really been what's driven European integration, and it's really interesting because even when you have leaders of both countries of different ideological stripes, for example, you have conservative Merkel in Germany and socialist Hollande in France, there's still this consensus in terms of trying to move Europe forward. Some disagreements on details, but they kind of agree on this. But I will say, though, that these views are not necessarily shared by other politicians of their stripes elsewhere. For example, conservative Cameron does not necessarily share conservative Merkel's desire for a more unified Europe.
That's goes with the context of British history in general. Being off the continent, they've always felt, that they were not really part of it.
Right, and in fact, one of the big points that's made about Churchill's speech that I referenced earlier about the United States of Europe is he didn't envision a role for Britain in that. It was only later on at the United Kingdom would eventually join the nascent European project after having its membership vetoed by France. That's another story. But, the thing is, federal models can be an excellent way of maintaining a fair and balanced distribution of power between a central government and local governments, which basically means that people have more input and say over a government that's closer to them. I think that's always beneficial. But it should be noted that sometimes tensions are just too strong and federations can fall apart. Examples of that include Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. But really the extent to which they were actually federal is questionable. Because, of course, you have this horrifying genocidal rage within the former Yugoslav states. You have resentment toward the domineering Russians in many of the former Soviet republics, which revealed that, it wasn't so much that there was a common consensus and interest in maintaining an entity as it was that there was a faux federation controlled by an elite from usually just one country. But I do want to say, I want to touch on one area. It's close to Europe, outside of it though, that could benefit from looking at a federal model as a compromise, and that's Israel. The tension between Israelis and Palestinians shows no sign of abating, and debates over a one or two state solution are really difficult because some people say two-state solution is ideal because it allows both peoples to be self-governing within their own countries, but both would be very weak and have odd borders with each other. The status of Jerusalem in a two-state solution is always messy, and a unitary state solution is unacceptable to Palestinians, and rightly so. They feel disenfranchised and unrepresented by the Israeli government. If a compromise could be found to develop a model similar to the Belgian model, which is a three-subject federation, you have Israeli territories, Palestinian territories, and make Jerusalem a special territory of its own, that could actually provide a legitimate structure. Now, I'm not saying that things wouldn't be tense and difficult, but it could create a sense of legitimacy and agreed-upon structure that could allow peaceful coexistence in the long term.
Well, there are definitely a lot of contentious issues that might make something like that difficult to go about, and that's not something we're going to be discussing today. That's for another time. So I guess what are some final thoughts we have on this subject before we end the podcast for this?
Well, I think that when we look at federalism, when we think of the way it works here in America, it produces a very different feel from when you look at it in Europe. And Europe's history, its unique history, contributes to that. The idea that the nation state can be a core. Because when you look at the European Union, and especially the German interest in it, Germany was kind of a proto-European union. It was a union of a bunch of different states, of different religions, powers and capacities and populations that came together and produced one of the most prosperous and progressive states in the world. And so it's understandable that some people might look at that as a prototype for Europe. But federalism can have its drawbacks. Federal power should not be so remote or so strong that it loses legitimacy or input from the people. And that's something that, is dangerous whenever you're dealing with any large-scale geographic entity like Europe would be, or like America is now. But when we think about the evolution of human government and systems of government, the Federation kind of can provide the best of both worlds. Whether it's a monarchy like Belgium or a republic like Germany, it allows for the best representation for people in their communities at a local level.
Alright then, this has been the Casual Historian Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then give us a rating and a review on iTunes. You can also find this podcast on the Casual Historian YouTube channel. And you can follow the Casual Historian on Facebook and Twitter. And go to casualhistorian.com for more content like this. You can email any comments, questions, or business inquiries to casualhistorian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.